Hello, everyone. I'm Susie Rayford, and I am a Principal Research Director at Pearson for our Cognitive and Intelligence products. And I'm so pleased to introduce to you Dr. Craig Frisbie. Dr. Frisbie is currently retired from his position as an Associate Professor in the School Psychology Training Program at the University of Missouri-Columbia. He has served as co-editor of School Psychology Review, the official journal of the National Association of School Psychologists. He has also served as member of the Technical Review Committee of the National Center on Response to Intervention and as associate editor for the APA journal Psychological Assessment. He is co-editor of the textbook Comprehensive Handbook of Multicultural School Psychology and author of Meeting the Psychoeducational Needs of Minority Students, Evidence-Based Guidelines for School Psychologists and Other School Personnel, as well as many other publications. And he's here today to present on knowns, unknowns, and best practices in cognitive assessment of diverse populations. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Frisbie. Welcome.
Thank you so much. To the audience members, I'm so pleased to be able to speak on this particular topic this afternoon. And I appreciate the folks at Pearson giving me an opportunity to present on this. This is a timely topic as attacks on testing have always been with us since the beginning of testing, and they continue to this day. Every time I look at the news, I see stories about colleges and universities who are getting rid of their SAT and ACT requirements due ultimately to concerns about outcomes for testing efforts, particularly with different groups. I started my graduate school work in the early 80s in California. And for those of you who live in California or who have lived in California for the past few decades or so, California was the site of a lawsuit called the Larry P. trial. I don't know if any of you remember that, but during that time, there was a lawsuit brought against the San Francisco School District, ultimately revolving around outcomes for IQ testing for special education purposes. And that lawsuit went on for a number of years, and it eventuated in a decision being made that Black students were not allowed to be evaluated with IQ tests in the entire state of California. So these issues will always be with us, and the purpose of this particular webinar is to discuss many of the criticisms that have been leveled against standardized testing, particularly IQ testing. We're going to talk about many different alternate assessment paradigms, what they claim, whether or not they have evidence to support their criticisms of IQ testing. And in the end, we're going to cover many of the principles that have been in the literature for quite a while related to this topic of bias and whether or not IQ testing is discriminatory against certain groups. So this webinar will basically bring that literature together for us. Just to give a quick overview of the topics, I'm going to discuss just basic learning objectives for this afternoon. In some of the slides, you'll see an icon that will alert you to the fact that when you took the pre-test and the post-test for this slide will be where you'll find those answers. We're going to define terms. Then we're going to basically go through many different alternate assessment paradigms. We're going to cover for each paradigm what they criticize about IQ testing. We're going to talk about their underlying assessment philosophy and rationale. We're going to describe the method, and then we're going to discuss many of the flaws of these methods. And at the end of all this, we're going to ask and answer the basic question whether or not popularly used IQ tests are indeed biased or discriminatory against certain American groupings. Then in the end, what I'd like to do is to link testing with actual issues that we find in classrooms. We don't use tests for the fun of it, but basically we use tests in order to answer referral questions about kids' behavior in classrooms and schools. So what I'd like to do is to take the opportunity to look at different ranges of IQ levels in students, look at the behaviors that you commonly see with those students in those different IQ ranges, and then talk about what the implications of those classroom behaviors are for the construct of general intelligence. And then 15 minutes before we end, I'd like to stop and take some questions and answers from the audience. So our learning objectives will be that we will want you to be able to describe, after the webinar is over, accurate and non-accurate definitions for the following terms: assessment, testing, equitable, discriminatory, non-discriminatory, bias, general mental ability, standardization, norms, and test session behavior. Then what we hope to accomplish is that you can describe at least 3 types of alternative assessment paradigms that have been proposed or promoted over the years as a substitute for traditional cognitive assessment. We'd like for you to be able to describe at least 2 pros and at least 2 cons of at least 3 different alternate assessment paradigms that have been promoted by scholars in school psychology and special education. And then whenever IQ tests cannot be used, we'd like for you to be able to describe classroom learning, behavioral, social, emotional, and academic achievement characteristics of students belonging to the full range of IQ levels. I mentioned before that some of you may have taken a pre-test before attending this webinar, and then afterwards you'll take a post-test to assess your learning. On this screen, we have a glasses icon, the purpose of which is basically here you go. Glasses icon, the purpose of which is to alert you to the fact that the answers to those pre-test and post-test questions are on this slide. So basically, this is an icon that just reminds us to pay particular attention to what you see on that particular slide. So what is the task before us? And basically, we want to get us acclimated to the fact that we are talking about an enterprise that many consider to be one of the greatest success stories in psychology. And one person says basically the scientific study of intelligence is probably the greatest success story in psychology, possibly in all of the social sciences. Another person says intelligence testing may be psychology's greatest single achievement. Yet in spite of this, intelligence and intelligence testing is subject to virulent hostility, aggressive promotion of misinformation from the popular press and media, and attempts to have their use curtailed or banned outright. And that's, in my opinion, is not an understatement. And there's an article that I wrote with a colleague that you may want to refer to that talks at length about the Larry P. versus Wilson Riles case, where intelligence testing was actually brought to court, and on a statewide level, intelligence test administration was banned for Black children in that state. So that'll give you some of the background of some of the politics that often occur behind the scenes when it comes to intelligence testing. During the heyday of Larry P. and its aftermath, the alternative assessment movement reached its peak in school psychology and special education journals. I began my graduate career in California in the early 80s. And this was a heavy topic in both school psychology journals and special education journals, where researchers would constantly promote what they called alternative assessment, which in their view corrected many of the flaws and shortcomings of IQ testing. And in their writing, they were hoping that we could get rid of standardized IQ testing to be replaced with an alternative assessment model. And this, in my recollection, has gone on. It started in the 70s. It concluded in full force through the 80s and 90s. And currently, I'm not seeing a lot of that literature in today's publications, but the 80s and 90s in particular were the times when you saw a lot of writing about alternative assessment. So sympathy for and curiosity about alternative assessments compared to traditional IQ testing never seems to die. So this presentation will answer head on the question, is traditional testing culturally biased? How would we find out? Is alternative testing a better choice for clinicians? And why or why not? So first, what I'd like to do is start by defining some basic terms so we're all on the same page. And we'll start with assessment. Assessment, we're going to define as the process of gathering, reviewing, and interpreting data or information from a single source or multiple sources in order to evaluate what students know, understand, or can do for purposes of educational decision making. So the term assessment is broader conceptually than the narrower term testing. Assessment is basically where we're gathering information for the purposes of making important decisions about test takers. Testing, in contrast, is a subset of the assessment process where individuals or groups are exposed to a series of questions, problems, or tasks that provide structured opportunities to demonstrate specific or general skills, eventually yielding a single score or set of scores. So whenever a diagnostician sits down in a room with an individual student and administers a standardized test, that is what we refer to whenever we talk about the testing enterprise. Testing, again, is a narrower construct compared to the broader construct of assessment. Whenever we gather scores from tests, we have to consult norms. So whenever we talk about norms, we're basically talking about scores from a representative reference group having known characteristics. In other words, characteristics related to the geographical region that they come from, their age, their racial or ethnic group membership, or their gender. And we're going to take those scores and compare them to scores that we collect from the individual that we are testing. When we collect our raw scores, many of you know that we have to then convert those scores to either age or grade scores, quotients, or standard scores. So that's the purpose of norms. It gives us an opportunity to take scores from an individual and then convert them to a more useful score that compares that individual score to the scores of a reference group. Standardization. The standardization is the process during the development of a test whereby rules are set which reinforce the idea that all test takers answer the same questions to be administered in the same manner for all test takers, and answers are scored in an identical or consistent manner. And this is necessary to ensure an accurate comparison between individual students and or groups of students. The reason why this term is important is that you're going to see that in many of the alternate assessment paradigms, they completely alter standardization procedures for tests. And there's just a general principle that we all learned in our beginning testing classes. And that is that when you alter the standardization procedures for tests, it tampers with the interpretation of the test scores. So standardization in terms of test administration and test interpretation is always very, very important in order for us to even interpret the score that we obtain from our examinees. Now let's go ahead and provide a definition for general cognitive ability, and we'll use this one. There are many definitions, but this is one that I particularly like, and this was written by Linda Gottfredson. She defined intelligence as a very general mental ability that, among other things, involves the ability to reason, plan, solve problems, think abstractly, comprehend complex ideas, learn quickly, and learn from experience. It is not merely book learning or a narrow academic skill or even test-taking smarts. Rather, it reflects a broader and deeper capability for comprehending our surroundings, catching on, making sense of things, or figuring out what to do. So again, there are many different definitions for intelligence, but this is the one that I particularly like because it captures many of the things that we think of whenever we are assessing intelligence in the context of schools and or clinics. A word that you'll hear many times in the testing literature is the word discrimination. In other words, we tend to talk about testing as being non-discriminatory. And that's an interesting word that needs to be talked about at length because this can be confusing. Whenever you hear the word discrimination being used in its broad sense, we think of this definition: an ability to discern differences in the qualities of people and things and choosing accordingly. Now, when you look at that definition, there's nothing objectionable about that definition because this refers to the process of basically discerning differences, and human beings do that every day. Whenever we get up in the morning, we have to discriminate between whether to wear this color clothing or another color of clothing. We have to discriminate as to what we're going to eat for breakfast. We're going to have to discriminate which roads to drive on going to work. And on and on and on, we discriminate as a basic matter of just thinking. So that's the broad definition of the word. It has no negative moral connotations at all. It just simply means discerning differences and choosing accordingly. But there's a narrow sense definition that we often think of whenever we use the word discrimination. That means treating people negatively based on arbitrary assumptions or aversions concerning individuals based on their race, ethnicity, appearance, sex, etc. So when we're talking about this narrow definition, this is where we begin to get into negative connotations, whereby we are understanding that word to mean that we are treating people differently based upon a characteristic. And usually we treat those people negatively. And that's why the word discrimination often has a negative connotation to it. When we use this word related to IQ testing, and people call IQ tests discriminatory, here is what they mean. They mean that there is something inherent in test content or the administration of tests that disadvantages a group or groups by artificially lowering their scores based on their race, ethnicity, language, sex, or another characteristic. So whenever you hear someone accuse IQ testing or any testing of being discriminatory, this is the definition that they are referring to, that there's something inherent in tests, whatever it is, that when test takers of a particular group take that test, their scores are artificially lowered. In other words, the test doesn't accurately tell you what the test taker can do because there's something inherent in the testing that is lowering their scores. And this is what is meant whenever anyone says that tests, particularly IQ tests, are discriminatory. You'll often hear the word test fairness, and this is an interesting word. And many times in advertisements for tests that you'll read about either in your guild newsletters or in some other source, they will usually advertise the virtues of the test by saying that this particular test is more fair to a particular group or subgroups. So you can get a sense as to what they are meaning when they use that word. But I'm going to argue, as to many other different psychometricians, that we want to avoid the use of the word fair when it comes to testing. And there's several reasons for that. Many clinicians, and I've read many articles and book chapters written by clinicians in promoting the virtues of an alternative assessment paradigm. They will argue that if clinicians can alter the test content, or if they can alter how a test is administered, or alter how scores are interpreted, or alter how scores are used for a particular group, that this will be more fair to test takers, and then they'll give a rationale for that. I'm going to argue that the issue of what is or is not fair really belongs to the realm of morality, philosophy, and metaphysics that defy objective agreement. Now, what I mean by defying objective agreement is that one clinician may argue that if we alter the way tests are administered or scored, this will be fair to persons from certain groups. But I can find another professional just as qualified that will argue that, no, that's not fair. So you'll see arguments over the use of fairness and that's because people have different definitions as to what they mean by a test being fair. I'm going to argue, as have many other psychometricians, that whenever we are investigating issues of test bias, that test bias is something that is investigated within the realm of empirical techniques related to psychometrics and statistics. In other words, you don't determine whether or not a test is fair or not because people have different definitions of what that means. And those definitions often contrast or oppose one another. If we can just limit our questions as to whether or not a test is biased or not to the realm of objective empirical techniques, we're always on good ground. So my point here is try not to use the term fairness to describe a test. Now you're going to see that word continue to be used in advertisements, but personally, try not to use that word because that word clouds rather than clarifies. So here we're going to talk about test bias, what it is and what it is not. Now I want you to look at this slide and basically look at this particular graph for a moment. You'll see that this is a graph that on the x-axis, it has IQ scores from low to high. And then on this axis, it basically has the scores from low to high. The red curve we'll call group A, and the blue curve we will call group B. And the reason why many of us in modern times are concerned about whether or not tests are biased or not is because different subgroups in the American population show different distributions of scores on IQ tests. And this shows you an example of what can often occur when IQ tests are given to a diverse society like American society or any other content in which you have different subgroups of people. One group may get a distribution of scores that has a mean average that is lower than another subgroup that is given the same test. And so because many feel that IQ tests should give the same distribution of mean scores for all groups. In other words, all groups should obtain the same mean on the distribution of IQ scores. If a test doesn't, then automatically people will say that therefore there must be something wrong with the test. And the quote here to the left gives you a common idea that you'll see represented in many psychology textbooks, where this person basically says, one way to keep minorities down was through intelligence testing. It has taken decades to prove this hypothesis incorrect and to reveal intelligence tests as culturally biased. So this kind of sums up what many people feel. They feel that there's something inherent in tests that discriminates negatively against one particular subgroup of individuals. In this particular case on this slide, they might feel that group A is being discriminated against by the test because they get a lower mean score than group B. And so that is one of the reasons why you see so much hostility against tests, and it never seems to go away from decade to decade, where again, the idea is that there's something wrong with tests. And so this question basically boils down to this following issue. And this is basically the question that we need to investigate. Is there something wrong with standardized IQ testing that causes average group differences between subgroups, or does standardized IQ testing merely reflect differences between groups? That's the basic question that we need to address today. Is there something wrong with the tests that cause these differences? And let's start with certain fallacies that have been written about by many folks, but we want to start with this because this is a fallacy that many people hold about IQ testing. Test companies will often hire individual experts or panels of experts belonging to certain ethnic, gender, or racial subgroups who will be customers for soon-to-be published tests. They are charged with the task of reviewing the test items in order to identify possible items that may be offensive or upsetting to future test takers from those groups. They do this so that offensive items could be removed from the final product whenever the test is published. This enterprise is often mislabeled as efforts to identify test bias. Now we need, again, here to be very careful about the words we use. This enterprise of soliciting individuals to just look at the test items and to determine which items are biased or not, this is not an enterprise related to test bias. This is more of a PR move by test companies where they want to make sure that there's nothing in the pictures and tests, or there's nothing in the words used that could possibly have political ramifications for customers buying the test. In other words, if there's something in the test that offends a group for whatever reason, it's either in the words used or how things are depicted in the pictures, test companies want to know that so they can not include those items in the test. And just to give you kind of an example that comes to mind off the top of my head, I remember that in many of the tests that we would use in our training program would have pictures, and then children were asked to basically match a word with a variety of pictures to see which picture best reflected that word. And sometimes some of the pictures would have a picture of a housewife ironing, let's say, at home. And some political groups would have objections to that because they felt that showing pictures that would show a woman ironing is a stereotype that basically demeans women. And so they may have objections to that picture because they felt that the test should include pictures that showed women in more non-traditional roles. And that is something that test companies are very concerned about because they want to make sure that they don't offend different groups. So the test company might take out that picture and replace that with a picture that shows a woman doing something that is more non-traditional. Okay, now that is a public relations enterprise by test makers. It's totally legitimate, but we should not call it an effort to identify test bias, because decisions about bias in terms in items are determined empirically, and they often contradict subjective judgments of item bias. In other words, some people may look at an item on its surface and say that particular item is biased, but when you look at the actual statistics that come from groups who take that item, you'll find that there's nothing wrong with it. So let's always keep in mind that whenever we talk about determining test bias, that needs to be determined empirically, not subjectively. So the culture-bound fallacy is defined this way. This fallacy concerns the notion that one can simply look at a test item and assume on that basis alone that it is biased or unfair when used with certain groups. And again, as I've said previously, bias must be determined empirically, not subjectively. There's another fallacy that we often make whenever we talk about test bias, and that's called the standardization fallacy. This fallacy rests on claims that because a test was standardized on a given population, it is ipso facto, in other words, by this fact, biased or unfair when used in any other population. In other words, in the early days of testing, many of the test developers did not include certain minority groups in their standardization samples, so that when the actual tests were published and it was found out that different groups achieved mean scores that were higher or lower than other groups, the argument would be that the lower scoring groups were not represented adequately in the standardization sample. And you know, there have been scholars that have looked at this issue, and they have basically determined the fallacy of this because they've identified many subgroups, particularly American subgroups, that were not represented at all in the standardization sample, yet they exceeded in their mean scores the white population of America. So it's not necessarily true that the scores that are achieved on tests are a function of how well they are represented in the standardization sample. And for a very excellent study that empirically looked at this, want to refer you to the study by Fan, Wilson, and Capes. And the references are provided at the end of this presentation, in which they systematically looked at this issue and they determined that there's nothing to this particular criticism. If you look in the latest documents published by AERA, APA, and NACME on particularly the newest test standards that were published in 2014. Now they're going to be updated, but the latest ones at the time of this presentation, it was 2014. Here is how they define what test bias is. They define it this way. Test bias is construct underrepresentation or construct irrelevant components of test scores that differentially affect the performance of different groups of test takers and consequently the reliability, precision, and validity of interpretations and uses of their test scores. In other words, what they're saying is that there's something about the measurement of a construct that is not represented in the test items, or there's some feature that is inherent in the test that is irrelevant to what you're trying to measure, that somehow affects tests in a way that it disadvantages the test scores, particularly in reliability or the validity of those scores for different subgroups. So this is a conceptual definition. This is basically saying that conceptually, if we're going to call a test as biased, it means that there's something that is irrelevant to what is being measured that is affecting test takers in a certain way. So again, this has to be determined empirically. And one way to determine that is what is called looking for predictive bias. That is, does a test predict something differently for one group than it does for another group? And they define predictive bias this way. Predictive bias is the systematic under or over prediction of criterion performance for people belonging to groups differentiated by characteristics that are not relevant to the criterion performance. So an example would be, let's say I would give an individual general ability IQ test to a group of high school seniors. And then I wanted to wait a couple years and I wanted to look where they are currently in a college program or some kind of a vocational training program and look at some scores 2 years later. And I would say that the test would underpredict scores if the scores that are achieved on the test tell test takers that they are going to do worse than they actually do. And so if it's under predicting, the IQ test says you're going to perform at a certain level on the predictor, and it turns out that the test takers perform better than what is predicted by the IQ test. That would be under prediction. If a test over predicted criterion performance, the test scores would say that you're going to achieve at a certain level and you actually did worse than the test scores say that you would achieve at. So by predictive bias, we're simply saying that the test does not predict in the same way for one group as it does for the other group. We want tests to predict accurately how someone will do on a set of predictor scores. When we use the term systematic error in basically the use of tests, we're referring to an error that consistently increases or decreases the scores of all test takers or some subset of test takers, but is not related to the construct that the test is intended to measure. Whenever we give general ability IQ tests, we want specifically that to be measured, general cognitive ability. But if there's some other feature that is being measured, let's say it's test wiseness or anxiety or proficiency with the English language, if that is being tested in addition to general mental ability, it might disadvantage certain groups of test takers relative to other groups. So whenever a test is biased, it's going to consistently work to increase or decrease the scores of a subset of test takers in a certain way. So I've gone through fairly quickly some definitions. Now let's dive into different alternative assessment paradigms that many researchers have promoted over the years. And we're going to ask the essential question, are they up to the job? For each alternative assessment paradigm, we're going to basically address 4 subtopics. We're going to say, what is the main criticism that the paradigm has of IQ tests that the alternative assessment method is meant to address? How do they put IQ tests down is another way to say it. We're going to talk about the underlying assumptions or rationale of the alternative assessment method. We're going to describe the features of the alternative assessment method. And then we're going to talk about the major flaws of the alternative assessment method. The first one we're going to talk about is called the system of multicultural pluralistic assessment, abbreviated SAMPA. Now, some of you in the audience may have no idea what the SAMPA is, and others of you who are a little bit older, who were around during the 70s and 80s, may fondly remember the SAMPA. The SAMPA was an assessment method that was being heavily promoted as an alternative to IQ testing. And basically, this is what one supporter of the method says about this method, and I'll just read this verbatim. This person said, SAMPA is philosophically committed to a pluralistic view of American society. It sees American society as composed of a dominant Anglo core culture and many identifiable unique cultural groups that vary in their degree of identification with Anglo values, language, lifestyles, habits, and social systems. The more distinct and homogeneous the ethnic group, the greater the difference in the life experiences of the children and the greater the need to look at the child within the context of his or her experiences. SAMPA does this by providing assessment with norms appropriate to a child's socio-cultural group. The procedure is not only equitable for youngsters, it also reflects cultural pluralism, or the belief that all cultures have equal worth and value, and that social strength comes from the continuance of diversity. Now, this is a lot to say. This is a mouthful, but this is the philosophy that underlied the creation of the SAMPA assessment program. And basically, this is how the method worked. Instead of using IQ scores that you obtain from a traditional assessment session, you would turn those IQ scores into what they called estimated learning potential, or ELP scores. ELP scores, now at the time this came out, it was the WISC-R, so it was an early version of the WISC. ELP scores or WISC-R IQ scores that have been adjusted for the effects of sociocultural background and compared only to the test taker's ethnic peer norms. The general effect is to raise estimates of intellectual potential for minority students compared to whites. This averaged to about 11 points for Black students and 7 points for Hispanic students. So in a nutshell, this is basically what the SAMPA ELP scores were about. And if you can just turn your attention to this left diagram here, the green bar basically refers to the scores made by group A, and the blue bar represents the scores that were made by group B. So in each bar, these are the lower scores going to the higher scores, lower scores going to the higher scores. So if you had a particular cutoff for some kind of a decision making, now let's say this was a cutoff for admittance to a gifted program in the school, you would see that having the same cutoff score would result in different proportions in the green bar that would be selected compared to the proportions in the blue bar. In other words, the proportion of group A would be less than the proportions selected from group B. And that is traditionally how things would work. When you give an IQ test, you have a certain cutoff and you make decisions based upon that one cutoff. Basically, what SAMPA does, it takes the scores from the lower scoring group and it adjusts those scores in relationship to only kids from that racial ethnic group. So for example, if that is done, what you have is basically ELP scores artificially raising the scores, excuse me, of the WSCAR IQs so that they would be comparable to the scores made by the group B. So in other words, if you were a member of group A, and let's say you got a score that was in the 80th percentile of WSCAR scores, but you were a kid from group B and you got a score that was in the 95th percentile, the kid that got the score in the 86th percentile would only be compared to his or her own ethnic group. And if this score was the highest, one of the highest scores made by that ethnic group, it would adjust the percentiles so that it would make those two scores equivalent. So it would artificially equalize, just by statistical manipulation, the scores of group A. And so these would be now called ELP scores, so that now if you have a certain cutoff, the same proportions of all groups would be admitted to the gifted program because they would have the same proportions that would obtain ELP scores in that particular range. So it artificially equalizes the scores just by statistical means. Another word we could call that is group norming. That's basically what's happening there. And the underlying philosophical argument is that there's something occurring in society that artificially depresses the scores for group A. So we need to apply a statistical correcting mechanism to basically raise their scores by comparing them only to people of their group. In a nutshell, various researchers conducted studies in the late 70s that basically studied the validity of these scores. And in a nutshell, these are some of the arguments that came out. Some critics disagree that there's a monolithic Anglo culture that is significantly different from minority cultures. They would argue that traditional IQ scores measure the same factors across all ethnic groups. There's no bias. They would argue that the standardization data for developing the SAMPA was only limited to one state, California. And they would also argue that the validity of ELP scores, when actually those scores were subjected to empirical verification by validity studies, that the validity was poor or non-existent for those scores, and that the SAMPA administration, because you had to do all of these manipulations, was not cost or time efficient. And this is basically, you know, if you read this, I won't, in the interest of time, I won't read this in its entirety, but basically ELP scores were found to overestimate the performance of minority students because they artificially raised the scores. It lowered the validity of those scores, and that the overall conclusion was that ELP scores were vastly inferior to IQ scores in predicting future achievement of kids. So those are just some of the reasons why this particular method basically died on the vine in the late 70s to early 80s. Another alternate assessment paradigm was based upon the observation that IQ tests were probably biased or not appropriate to give to all groups because there are different dialects represented across the United States. And because different kids have different regional dialects, they were likely to do poorly on intelligence tests. So here's the argument that these individuals would use. They would say that due to cultural isolation, some English-speaking American subgroups speak in dialects that differ from mainstream standard English. Thus, they would have difficulty understanding or responding to verbal instructions or verbally loaded test items that were worded in a proper English dialect. So some of those examples may be, you've heard the term Ebonics, and that's a label created by a group of Black scholars. It's a combination of the word ebony and phonics to refer to a type of African-American vernacular distinctly different from standard American English. You have some sections of the country that speak a dialect called Chicano English, and you have some individuals from certain parts of the country that speak Cajun vernacular. So here's an example of those comparisons. Here's an example of on the left side, you have the standard English. Then on the right side, you have the Ebonics grammar. So whereas in standard English, we would say he is going. If someone was speaking Ebonics, they would say he going. Or if standard English says, I have 5 cents, the Ebonics says, I got 5 cents. And then you can read all the way down as to what those differences are. So again, the argument is that a child who speaks this dialect would do poorly on intelligence tests because intelligence tests are standardized in standard English. So during that time, this was the early 70s, a group of scholars, the most prominent of which was Professor Robert Williams. He's since passed away, but he developed a test called the Bitch 100 test. That stands for Black Intelligence Test of Cultural Homogeneity. And these consisted of basically multiple choice items. And these are some of the examples of what would be on that test. Here's one item. If a judge finds you holding wood in California, what's the most he can give you? And if you grew up in a kind of an urban inner city Black environment, you would know that the right answer is a dime. Now, what that means, I'm not sure, but that's keyed as the right answer. Here's another one. Running a game means, and then you have 4 choices, and the correct answer is getting what one wants. So the Bitch test was composed of various items of this type. And here is what was found. When administered to a sample of Black and white young adults, there was no overlap in the distribution of scores within the 2 groups. In other words, the Black sample had a significantly higher mean. The white sample had a significantly lower mean. But when the researchers tried to correlate scores on the Bitch 100 with Wechsler verbal or performance scales, the correlation was not significantly different from 0. So it had no correlation with established intelligence tests. And then there was no evidence that this test measured general intelligence or demonstrated significant predictive validity for any variable of practical importance within either Black or white groups. So when this test was subjected to standard reliability studies, validity studies, it basically crashed and burned. It had no use or value for anything. Okay, here's another alternative assessment paradigm, and it was called learning potential assessment. And the reasons why I have the picture of this gentleman here, this is Professor Reuven Feuerstein, and he was a Jewish Israeli psychologist that developed this method in Israel. So that's who this individual is. And this method was being promoted in the late 70s. It went throughout the early 80s. It kind of crashed and burned, but it's been resuscitated, and this method is still going strong in some circles. But let's kind of go over what the underlying philosophy of this method teaches. This method argues that due to their deficient upbringing and impoverished environmental backgrounds, disadvantaged children need an assessment method that gives them the tools and encouragement to demonstrate to examiners what they can do when given the chance. And if you knew anything about the context within which Feuerstein developed this method, remember, he was an Israeli psychologist, and there were a lot of wars going on in Israel at the time, where there were a lot of Israeli groups that were being dispossessed by other invading forces, and they were poor and impoverished. And he kind of felt that this would put these kind of children who had these kind of backgrounds at a disadvantage. So that's one of the that was the context within which he developed this particular method. And these are the criticisms that he had for this method. Feuerstein argued that a traditional IQ score, particularly when it's obtained from subjects belonging to disadvantaged populations, is inadequate as an assessment of learning capabilities or learning potential, because traditional IQ tests are accused of failing to identify what he called deficient cognitive functions. He argued that IQ tests assess what has been learned in the past up to the point of testing, but they do not assess the subject's potential for future learning. IQ tests do not allow clinicians to observe cognitive processes that underlie learning. They do not allow the clinician to assess the role of motivation in test performance. And IQ tests do not allow clinicians the opportunity to assess the role of or the amount of instructional investment needed to help test takers improve their cognitive learning performance. So in a nutshell, he's basically saying that if you're a child that comes from a poor or an impoverished background, you don't have the prior experiences that would give you the skills to demonstrate what you could do on IQ tests. So what we need to do to equalize for that is we need to give you the opportunity to manipulate the test administration so that you can demonstrate what you are capable of learning. Because if you were to give the test standardized to these kids, you're going to miss their potential for future learning. That's the argument. So some of you may have been exposed to this method. It goes under a variety of names, and you'll notice the glasses up at the top. So this is something that you might want to pay attention to for your post-test. This method goes under a variety of names. Sometimes you would call this method dynamic assessment. Some books have been written using that name. Another name is learning potential assessment, but that has been, the word potential has been updated to the word propensity. So the acronym is LPA, but sometimes it means learning potential assessment. Sometimes it means learning propensity assessment. Sometimes you'll hear this paradigm referred to as interactive assessment, or sometimes you'll hear this referred to as test, teach, test, procedure. So it goes by these different names, but they all basically have one thing basically in common. And this is basically how this method works. And you'll notice the glasses up top. Step one is that you'll sit down with a child, you administer the IQ test using standardized procedures. You don't vary from that. and you obtain the standardized score. But you don't stop there. In step 2, using the same or similar test items, you take time to train the subject how to solve the item. So you basically take the time to teach how to accomplish the test requirements by actually training them how to do it. And again, there's no standardized procedure for doing this, but all you do is basically train them in how to properly interact with that particular test material. The third step is that you retest the subject using either the same or alternate test items using standardized procedures to obtain the score. So again, you give the test using standardized procedures, you take time to train them in the procedures that you use to successfully complete the items. Then step 3 is that you re-administer either the same test or a different test, obtain the score. Then step 4 is you look at the score that you obtained from step 1, compare it to the score that was obtained from step 3. And if the difference between those scores is that the person improves on step 3 compared to step 1, that score is his change score, or what they would call his learning potential score. And in their paradigm, that would say to you that the child, given the appropriate instruction, is capable of learning at a level beyond what he achieved at step 1. That's in a nutshell the general idea behind that. So to give you an example of how that works is, you see over here to the right, you have a figural matrices item. And during step 1 of the learning potential procedure, you would just administer this item with no additional instructions. And basically the child has to figure out what the right answer is of the piece that goes here. Step 2 would be that if he gets this wrong and he gets subsequent items of this type wrong, you would take time as the examiner to actually teach how to correctly answer these items. So I would sit down with a child and say, okay, you see these figures and there's something missing here. So I would teach the child that you would look at the upper left-hand corner and find the pattern that is in evidence as you move from left to right. And that same pattern is here in this row as you move from left to right. The same pattern is in this row as you move from left to right, but yet this is missing. Then I would explicitly say to the child, you can do the same thing going from top to bottom. In this column, as you go from the top figure to the bottom figure, there's a pattern. As you go from this top figure in this column to the bottom figure, there's a pattern. And if you go from this top figure to this bottom figure, there's a pattern, but this is missing. So I would explicitly teach the child what to look for in this pattern. So I would say something on the order of, okay, look here, if I'm going this way, there's 2 figures, then there's 3 figures, then there's 4 figures, 2, 3, 4. Then I would say in this particular pattern, there is 4 figures, 2 figures, 3 figures. So there's always going to be 2, 3, and 4, but they might be in different orders. So in here, there's 3 figures, there's 4 figures. What must be here? And then I would coach the child to say the right answer. There should be 2 figures here. I would do the same thing going down. I would say 2 figures, 4 figures, 3 figures, 3, 2, 4, 4, 3. There must be 2. Okay. Then I would encourage him to notice the shapes. I would say these are squiggly lines or squiggly arrows. These are crescents. These are ovals. These are kind of crescent figures. These are ovals. These are squiggly lines. These are diamonds. These are jagged lines. And then there must be something here that's not a jagged line or not a diamonds. Then it's the same thing this way. Squiggly arrows, crescents, diamonds, crescents, ovals, jagged lines, ovals, squiggly lines. There must be something here. So when you put all this together, the person has to put basically in this box something that is basically 2, and it has to be 2 because that's the pattern, 4, 3, and 2, and 2 is not represented. And then it has to be something that is not a squiggly arrow or an oval. If you want to get deeper into this, you could also basically tell them about, you know, the position here. This goes left, this goes diagonal, then this goes up. This goes left, this goes diagonal, this goes up. This goes left, this goes diagonal, this goes up. So then if you work all of that out, then they would need to basically pick something here that is 2 and that faces up. And basically when you look at these choices and you figure out what it is, it's number 1. So I would go through all of this with the child to basically teach them how to do these kinds of problems. I would retest them again, and I'm going to get a change score. So as an example, if I were to give a 20-item test and I were to take raw scores from each test, if the child got an 8 on test 1, but a 10 on test 2, his change score would be +2. If he got an 11 on test 1, 5 on test 2, his change score would be -6. If he got a 9 on test 1, a 9 on test 2, his change score would be 0. So the learning potential assessment method basically concentrates on these change scores. And it basically makes the argument that if a child achieved a change score that was positive and high, that score represented the fact that that child had great learning potential. And if another child didn't make a score that high, he would have less of a learning potential from the first child. So that's kind of the idea of that particular assessment method. Criticisms of this method, and I and a colleague wrote an article about this that we published in the Journal of Special Education. In essence, LPA theory sets up straw men to knock down. To give an example of what is meant by that, a cornerstone of the learning potential theory is to accuse traditional IQ tests of not providing opportunities for examinees to be taught how to solve test problems through teaching. That's a main cornerstone of their argument. Yet, when you look at traditional tests, we see that nearly all IQ tests include standardized opportunities for examinees to be taught how to solve test items, usually at the beginning of the relevant subtest. So when you look at the WISC or the Stanford Binet or what have you, and you're about to begin a subtest, many of those tests give you an opportunity to give a sample practice item, to look at how the child does on the item. Then if they don't do well on the item, you can basically explain to them how to complete the item successfully. All of that is part of the standardization procedures for traditional tests. So right away, the learning potential assessment method is setting up a straw man by saying that traditional tests don't give test takers an opportunity to practice how to do test items. But there are other deeper reasons, more psychometrically technical reasons, why change scores are unacceptable as a method for interpreting anything from just simple change scores. So basically, when you look at some of the writings of psychometricians who have criticized this method, they would argue that and look at this right hand portion for a moment. Why can change scores change from one testing to the next, assuming similar homogeneous items? And this came from an excellent chapter by Gluting and McDermott, written in 1990, where they looked at the learning potential method and they saw serious psychometric problems with how change scores are interpreted. And their argument was basically that there's many situations in which you could have scores that change from one testing to another testing that have nothing at all to do with anything that has changed on the inside of a child's thinking. And for example, they say that, sometimes when you give two tests too close in proximity to one another, you can have practice effects. And that's basically because you gave tests at too close of an interval of time. You can have forgetting effects when you give tests in which there is too long of a period of an interval between the tests. There's also a psychometric principle that if you retest a child on an identical test compared to an alternate test, the gains will always be greater on an identical test, simply from the fact that the test items are the same. Or you could have tests that differ in their difficulty levels. So the same child will get a higher score on one test because it's an easier test than the other test because it's a more difficult test. In coaching research, we see that coaching gains are larger on nonverbal items compared to verbal tests, meaning that it's very, very difficult to coach larger scores from items that include, having to tell the meaning of words or sentences compared to items that involve having to do figural matrices. Coaching gains are always larger on nonverbal tests because they are nonverbal tests. It's very difficult to get gains on verbal tests. And then simply due to the test's unreliability, if nothing changes within the child, you can get different scores on tests simply from the fact that test scores are always have some degree of unreliability in them. This is another highly technical reason where basically they worked out a formula where you can actually calculate the reliability of a different score. And basically they found that when you look at the reliability of different scores, they are very, very unreliable. In other words, they can't be counted on to tell you really anything about underlying performance. And here's another test. If you look at the left-hand column, for example, if you take the reliability of test 1, if it's 0.9, take the reliability of the second test, which is 0.95, calculate the correlation between test and 1 and test 2. Let's say it's 70. The reliability of the change score using that previous formula I showed you in the previous slide will come out to be 0.75. But look at this right-hand column here. If you use the same reliability of test 1, 0.9, the same reliability of test 2, 0.95, but you increase the correlation between test 1 and test 2 so that instead of being 0.7, it's 0.9, you have a higher correlation. You put these numbers into the formula and the reliability reduces drastically to 0.25. In other words, the higher the correlation between test 1 and test 2, the lower the reliability will be of the change scores. And for those of you who use tests regularly, 0.25 is abysmal as a reliability estimate for any score. And so the LPA people would say change score means learning potential. Psychometricians would say the change scores are garbage. They're basically don't tell you anything. And that's the main criticism that basically nuked the learning potential assessment movement. In fact, it was actually used in San Francisco schools, I think in the early 80s. and they found that the method was just too cumbersome to use for busy psychologists, and they abandoned that method after a couple years. So this method actually crashed and burned because it's too cumbersome to give for busy professionals, and because change scores are notoriously unreliable. Now, some have argued that the way to correct bias in tests is that we shouldn't give verbal test items at all. We should test exclusively with nonverbal test items. And so this is an example here of a figural series nonverbal test item. It doesn't include, well, it includes minimal use of words, but basically the child will look at this pattern and then figure out which one of these choices goes here. And again, you're not asking the child to problem solve with words or sentences or anything of that nature. They're just doing everything non-verbally. And many scientists thought that that would reduce bias in testing for various American subgroups. So here's another kind of variant of that criticism. They would argue that some groups are so disadvantaged in the sense that they do not have important cultural experiences or access to certain kinds of verbal information in order to perform well on tests. So for example, if you included a test item of this nature, this is a verbal analogies test item. So this says shack is to skyscraper as canoe is to, and then the choices are wood, building, yacht, raft. The right answer is yacht. Okay. They would argue that a poor inner city child would not know what a yacht is compared to a more affluent child. So that poor inner city child would get that item wrong compared to the more affluent child who would be more likely to know what a yacht is. And that's the argument. So the argument is we should only give tests non-verbally, that's quote unquote fair for all children in schools. Jeff Braden wrote a series of articles in, I think it was a Journal of Psychoeducational Assessment, and others have written articles basically criticizing this method because of the following reasons. Number one, if you only use a test that has nonverbal items, this is something that result in an underrepresentation of the construct you're trying to measure. You're trying to measure general intelligence, and conceptually, general mental intelligence involves facility with verbal material. But if you only use nonverbal material, you're only using a certain portion of your test items measuring only a certain portion of the construct, general intelligence. And that is not good to do simply on the basis of the fact that you're underrepresenting the construct that you're purporting to measure. And then there's a more empirical reason for not having faith in just nonverbal testing. And that is that when you conduct group differences studies on nonverbal items compared to verbal items, you'll find that even if you give all items non-verbally to groups, you still have subgroup differences in the distributions of mean scores across subgroups. So giving a test non-verbally does not erase subgroup differences. Black-white mean score differences are roughly the same, regardless of whether test items are verbal or nonverbal, provided that the nonverbal test does not load highly on a spatial visualization factor. If nonverbal items load highly on this factor, then this will increase black-white differences on just nonverbal test items. Homogeneous tests with a high spatial visualization factor are paper folding, block counting, rotated figures, block design, object assembly, and mazes. So if you only give these tests to American subgroups, you will still see large group differences in mean scores. Giving a test totally non-verbally does not erase group differences. Okay, this was addressed a little bit previously. The belief that bias can be detected from a superficial inspection of item content. That reflects a more fundamental misconception. And that misconception is called the Specificity Doctrine as a misconception. You'll see the glasses are there because this is going to be included on your post-test. The Specificity Doctrine says tests measure nothing other than the specific bits of knowledge and learned skills reflected in the content of the test. Therefore, if a test taker has not been exposed in the past to the specific content of the test items, then he or she cannot be expected to do well on the test compared to another test taker who has been exposed to that item content. So to put this in a practical sense, if I give a vocabulary test to a child, and a vocabulary test is basically saying a word and asking a child to define verbally what that word means. If a child does poorly on that, the argument would be, well, in the child's cultural background, he's not given opportunities to define words verbally. So that's why he did poorly on the test, because he never had any background experiences in his home life or in his school life where he's had to define words. And that's why he did poorly. That reflects the Specificity Doctrine, because you're making assumptions as to what a specific test measures. With the vocabulary test, yes, everyone can see that it measures the ability to define words presented orally. Everyone can see that. But in reality, that and other tests measure much more, many things deeper that you can't see from just looking at that test on its surface. And this is where we need to know a little bit about latent constructs that are measured by any particular subtest. If you take this diagram, and this rectangle basically reflects the variance of a particular subtest. Variance means variability. So this is from low to high score. This is the variance of a particular subtest. The variance of any particular subtest consists of 4 basic elements. The most fundamental element that is measured by that subtest is called the G factor. That is variance that is due to what all mental tests share in common. If a test involves mental manipulation, mental activity, it measures G, no matter how different that test looks on its surface. Every mental test measure G to some extent. So using the example of that vocabulary test I talked about, if I ask a kid to orally define words, part of what is being measured by that test is the G factor. And that is something that test shares in common with every other test on the WISC, on the Stanford Binet, whatever test you use, the G factor is being measured. The second thing that is measured by any particular subtest is called group factors. A group factor is the variability that is due to what that test shares in common with groups of similar tests. So the vocabulary test, using that as an example, it measures something unseen in common with every other subtest that measures verbal skills, whether it's, interpreting sentences, comprehending sentences, talking about how 2 words are similar or different, anything that involves verbal ability, that vocabulary test measures in common with those kinds of tests. And that's called a group factor. The third is test specificity, and that is variance in that test that is unique to that test only, that it does not share in common with any other test. So when we look at the vocabulary test as an example, there is something that is measured by the vocabulary test that it doesn't share in common with any other test, that's just unique to that test. That's called test specificity. And then finally, all tests have error in it, and that's noise variance that contributes to test unreliability. The specificity doctrine basically is an argument that says this is the only thing that a test measures, what you can see with your own naked eye. So this is, to commit the specificity error, you would say that the only thing that the vocabulary test measures is this, that it doesn't share in common with any other test. And that's wrong. It measures all of this. The reason why the specificity doctrine is incorrect is that when you use factor analytic methods, you factor analyze a variety of tests and you derive latent factors that show what it is that they do measure. All tests measure G and group factors, and that's something that you cannot see. So any test that is in a mental test battery is simply a vehicle for the measurement of these latent constructs. In other words, if you give a vocabulary, arithmetic test, similarities, matrices tests, whatever it is, those tests are vehicles for measuring G and group factors. Even though tests may differ considerably in their surface feature, they nevertheless can measure the same underlying mental constructs. Latent mental constructs are not reducible to specific bits of acquired knowledge or skills. So practically what that means is, the reality is that you can test kids who have never seen an item type ever before in their life, and they'll do fine on it. They'll do extremely well. And similarly, you can test kids that have a lot of experience with the content of a test item and they still do poorly on it. That's because the children are high or low in G or high or low in group factors that you can't see as to what is being measured by that test. So the specificity doctrine is basically saying, again, just to review that if a child does well or poorly on a test, it's only because of their background experiences having exposure to those test items. No, tests measure a lot more constructs that are deeper than what you can see on the surface of that particular test item. So this specificity doctrine just simply is not valid. Here's just a diagram that basically gives you the essence of what G is. G is general mental ability. Spearman in 1927 defined G as involving educing. Eduction means to draw out. You're educing relationships or correlates. Now, what does that mean? That just simply means that you can take any mental test item, reduce it down to its basics, and you're given fundaments, you're giving test content. You have to find the relationship between those two fundaments. So if I tell you how is a pencil and a pen alike, the pencil and the pen would be the fundaments. Having to tell how they're alike, that is called educing relations. In this example, you're given the fundament. You're not giving the other fundament, but you're given the relationship between the two. So if I say hot, what is the opposite of hot? Hot would be the fundament. Opposite would be the relation. You have to find out what the other fundament is. So if I say, what is the opposite of hot? You would have to find out that it's cold. And so basically all mental tasks involve that particular, those particular processes. I'm going to skip through this really fast here because I'm seeing I'm running out of time and I want to get to the last part. This is basically an assessment method that was published by Eleanor Armour Thomas and Sharon Ann Gopal McNichol. It's called biocultural assessment. Basically what that is that says that if you have children who come from a variety of international backgrounds, you have to give many other kinds of assessment in addition to IQ assessment in order to be accurate as to what their mental capabilities are. So let me just go through this. You have to give a health assessment. You have to give an acculturation assessment. You have to give parent-teacher questionnaires, prior educational experiences, family community support assessment, musical intelligence, body kinesthetic intelligence, personal intelligences. You have to give multiple intelligence assessments. I'm just going to go through this really quickly. You can also manipulate the items that you give, so you can deviate from standardization procedures to basically modify the items in certain ways to give you an accurate assessment. These are the problems. The basic problem is that there's no research on this method. And because you're violating so blatantly the standardization procedures, this basically renders any results that you get meaningless. Okay, curriculum-based assessment. There's a lot here. What I'm going to do here, I see I still have many paradigms to go, but I want to get to the end because I want to make this all practical. So let me skip through curriculum-based assessment for a moment. You can read that for yourself. Portfolio, performance, or authentic assessment. I'm going to skip through that. Assessment with non-English speakers or limited English speakers. I'm going to go through that. Test preparation programs. Test session behavior. Or banning cognitive test administration altogether. Some writers say that you should just get rid of IQ tests and the world would be a lot better. There are problems with that. The basic idea that I'm just trying to put together in a nutshell is that tests are not psychometrically biased when given to American-born English-speaking groups. Basically, when you look at all of the empirical literature that have evaluated tests, you can give them with confidence to all groups that were born in America and that speak English. If you want to give a test to someone who does not speak English as their primary language, you can give them a test that is standardized on their primary language, or at best, you can give them a nonverbal test. Although again, there are some certain problems with purely nonverbal tests, but you can do either one of those two. If they speak an exotic language, you need to get an examiner that also speaks that language to be present while tests are given. So those are just some of the issues that you're faced with non-English speakers. But I wanted to get to this part because this is the part that is the most practical. We're not talking about tests, but we're basically talking about what is it that tests measure. We don't give tests for fun. We give tests simply because there has been a referral made. A teacher has noticed some problems in the classroom, and he or she is referring that child for testing so that you can confirm whatever it is that teacher suspects. So I just want to end with this so that we can make this presentation a bit more practical for you. So this shows you a normal curve. Everyone has seen that. Basically, these figures are the percentages of test takers that fall within these different segments of the normal curve. These are the IQ scores that correspond to those segments of the normal curve. So 100 is the mean, and then you have these extreme scores that are less frequent to either the left or the right of the mean. And then these are the percentiles. So what I want to do now is I just want to isolate different ranges of the distribution so that you can see how ranges of IQ scores actually relate to actual behaviors that are observed in classrooms. So I want to start with this segment of the normal curve. And this is, of course, any child who falls below an IQ that equals or is lower than 70. What are the behavioral correlates of people in that IQ range? Well, basically, IQs that are equal to or less than 70, or at least 2 standard deviations below the mean, in order to be referred for a special education class, you also have to have deficits in adaptive functioning that need special education. So special education researchers have subdivided IQs below 70 as being in basically these 4 categories: mild mental handicaps, IQs between 55 and 70. You will find some kids like that in schools, but they definitely need special education. Second category is moderate mental handicaps, that are people with an IQ of 40 to 55. Usually those kids are not in public school. They're identified very young, and they usually have to receive special education outside of the regular school. Severe mental handicaps, those are IQs between 25 and 40. And those are individuals that tend to have associated medical problems or genetic problems related to Down syndrome, spina bifida, or cerebral palsy. And then at the lowest, you have profound mental handicaps. These are IQs below 25. And these are individuals that often are non-ambulatory. They cannot move on their own. They need to be in a wheelchair, and they require round-the-clock institutional care. So I think individuals with IQs below 70 are easy to identify in the real world because their handicaps are significant, they're observable. And when it comes to even ones that have IQs between 55 and 70, you'll see that they have considerable difficulty as they encounter academic material in the public schools. So these are some problems from birth. They're developmentally behind. Social emotionally in the early grades, they act no differently from higher IQ pupils rather. But as soon as they encounter academic material, that's when the problems are most salient. They are at least 2 years behind their peers in the academic subjects. They have significant memory and attentional difficulties. At best, the most they can achieve is learning up to the 6th grade, and they need special education services no later than the 4th grade. This next group are individuals who have IQs between 70 to 85. And we would tend to call these individuals the slow learners. And this is a very difficult group to deal with in the public schools because they fall within the cracks. They have problems when faced with regular education, but they're not severe enough to require special education. So these are some of the problems that you'll see in those groups. Again, they fall between the cracks. They have considerable difficulty with multi-step or cognitively complex tasks. They prefer concrete over abstract learning, particularly in high school. And as they go up in grades and kids kind of widen in their ability levels in terms of how they manifest themselves, these are the kids that avoid more abstract subjects like algebra, chemistry, geometry, physics, or whatever, and they tend to gravitate towards vocational technical classes in high school. They have difficulty generalizing learned material to new situations. They have a restricted fund of general knowledge, short attention span, poor concentration. They need additional practice, longer amounts of time to learn. They don't like to read, and they have poor reading comprehension skills. They have low academic motivation, a growing dislike of school as they go through school, and they're more highly likely to drop out. And they tend to be the C and D students in classrooms. And they also tend to have higher social problems. Going through this real fast here. The next group is the group that is right in the middle. Individuals that have IQs between 90 and 110. Most school-aged pupils fall within this range, and it's hard to basically identify these kids as standing out because they're average. So because they're average, if they don't have specific learning disabilities, they can reasonably learn at grade level tasks. These kids within 90 to 110 will only stand out if the other kids in their cohort are significantly higher or lower than them in IQ. And here's what I mean by that. If an average IQ child is in a classroom where most of the other kids are lower IQ than them, they will appear to be bright compared to those kids. Or if an average IQ child is in the context of a classroom where most of the peers are high IQ, they will appear slower. So again, these are the kids that are right in the middle. They're average. They can reasonably perform most grade level tasks, but they will only stand out if the rest of the kids around them are either super high IQ or super low IQ. Okay, kids between 115 and 130 are your high average kids. And these are some of the traits that you'll see in that group. These are kids that generally enjoy school subjects for which they have a personal interest. They enjoy reading. They're good readers from an early age, and they're self-motivated to read books of interest. They like to go to the library. When book fairs come around, they like to go to book fairs and check out books of their interest. When they get to high school, they take the advanced classes in the electives, physics, chemistry, trigonometry, foreign languages. In high school, they tend to be enrolled in advanced placement classes, and they are generally the A and B students in the class. And then finally, we have the high IQ kids. These are kids of 130 IQ or over. These are very rare in the general population, but from birth, they reach developmental milestones faster than average IQ peers. They tend to use advanced vocabulary that is unusual for their age. They have a noticeably higher degree of curiosity about the world. They easily engage in complex thinking, and they can easily grasp abstract concepts. For example, high school calculus. I've known kids that have taken calculus and been successful at it in the 11th, 12th grades. These are kids that can persevere on intellectual tasks for long periods of time that are age appropriate. They have a broad spectrum of intellectual interest. They're good at many subjects, not just one, but they tend to be all around good students in a variety of subjects. Strong critical thinking skills. Many of them can achieve and are placed at 1 to 2 grade levels above their same aged peers. So they're often skipped ahead when appropriate. And when you get to the super high IQs, it's not unusual for super high IQs to go to graduate school in their pre-teens, or there's even examples of individuals who have received their PhD degrees in their late teens or early 20s. So I rushed through that. I'm sorry I did that. Let's stop at this point and see if we have some questions from the audience.
Hi, Dr. Frisbie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. We have a few questions from the audience that we would love for you to address.
Okay.
Here's the first. Given what we know about IQ testing not being biased against or towards specific groups, why do you think these misconceptions about IQ remain, not just in the general population, but also within the testing community? Why do you think the Larry P. precedent has not been challenged in court? I've pasted the question in so you can see it in our host panel.
Okay, now that is a very excellent question. Let me address the last one first. I've had some conversations with professionals, not only in California school psychology, but in other states as well. And I know very well one of the key players in the whole Larry P. drama that went on. This person used to be a professor of mine back in California, and they were also the head of the California Association of School Psychologists. And the basic answer there is that it requires a lot of money to collect, to fight these kinds of decisions. They had to raise thousands of dollars to meet with lawyers to actually put together, I forget the name of it. There's a legal name that is given to a brief that you put together. I think it has the words "Friends of the Court" in it, that they presented to the judges to say that basically we present psychologists within the state of California. We object to this ruling on the following reasons. And even though they did their best to argue their case, of course, they did not win. So the first answer to that is it just requires a lot of money. It requires a lot of psychologists to be on the same page. And that's another reason why you haven't seen challenges to this, is that what I remember when we were going through it in the 70s and 80s, there was only a small minority of psychologists that looked at the literature and saw that there was nothing wrong with IQ tests, but there was a surprisingly large number of psychologists that felt in agreement with the court that there was something wrong with tests, they were biased, and they shouldn't be used. So even school psychologists could not agree on their assessment of testing. And that was unfortunate, because if we were able to promote a united front, I think, we could go a lot further. But there are a lot of psychologists that are either in bed with a particular alternative assessment method, or they just believe for whatever reason that there's something wrong with tests and that they're biased. So we can't even get ourselves together as psychologists to agree on what we believe about tests. And then, again, when you go to the general public, this is such a political area. To give you an example of the politics of it, there was a similar case that was going on in Chicago that had the same features as the Larry P. case, but the plaintiffs and the defendants in the Chicago case, they were more evenly represented by minority psychologists. So just the optics of seeing minority psychologists who wanted to defend tests had a different political result that happened in Chicago than it did here in California. In California, the underlying politics was, we are evaluating an instrument that is bad for Black students. And most of the defenders of IQ testing did not have any minority plaintiffs or defendants, didn't have many minority defendants to argue for the usefulness of IQ tests. So a lot of it was political. California thought that they were going to do some great things to rearrange the proportions of minority kids in special ed. And when you look at the data, it didn't do anything of the sort. There's still an overabundance of minority kids in classes for the mentally handicapped.
Thank you. We have several questions about what you would recommend for an alternative assessment in California. And thanking you for the criticisms of the alternative assessments.
Again, that is a good question, but I'm sorry to report that California has struggled with that over the many years. Like this decision came down in the 80s, and ever since then, school districts have been struggling with alternatives, and nothing seems to work. We had a symposium on this at NASP. I think it was about maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And we were looking forward to hearing from some of the California psychologists what they could recommend. And really, there was nothing that came from that. Usually whatever you would try has significant drawbacks to it. And so I'm sorry to report that right now we're just at a standstill. I think most right-thinking school psychologists feel that the decision should have been overturned, but they just either don't have the will or the money to do so. So they just put up with whatever alternative procedures there are, and there are serious problems with anything that is an alternative. So there is no answer. There have been efforts to try to put together alternative methods, but they just haven't passed muster in terms of psychometrically or being popular for widespread use. So there are problems there. What is needed, in my personal opinion, is that we just need to get together, put together the money, and fight this. Because there were many minority parents that tried to fight this decision, and there were some modifications that the judge made, but then the special education statewide department just basically doubled down and reverted back to the IQ tests are banned for everything for Black students. So there are minority plaintiffs that are willing to challenge this, but again, you have to have the money, you have to have the political will, and you have to have the stamina to fight this. So I would just recommend, if you want to, read some of mine and our colleagues' opinions about this, read that article in Contemporary School Psychology, and you might be able to get some ideas there as to what needs to happen in order for this to be overturned. But right now, unfortunately, this is the law of the land in California.
Thank you. While we're on this topic, to what do you attribute the group differences on IQ and other testing?
Well, this has been something that has been present ever since the beginning of testing. And so, in fact, there is no such thing as any subgroup getting equal mean scores anywhere on the planet. Any continent you go to has group differences in scores, even among populations that are racially the same. You can always find subgroups that have different mean IQ scores. And so that usually leads to people worrying about genetics versus environment. My argument to that is you don't need to worry about that stuff. You just need to be worried to worry about what kids actually do. And in all groups, you'll find the full range of IQ scores, from mental retardation to genius level. All groups have that. It's just that the mean is different. And so from what I read about in the scientific literature, there is no test that can be definitively done that can give you a definite, this much is genetics, this much is environment. Usually scientists just have estimates where they estimate the role of genetics and environment. And that might be interesting on a on a scientific level, but I'm more concerned just about the practical school level. It is what it is. So when you give a test, you can rest assured that tests have been vetted for their reliability and validity with all English-speaking groups, American born, and leave it at that, and just deal with modifying education to basically serve kids at different levels. A lot of where the energy seems to be is that if you have kids that have lower IQs, you can still give good education there, and you can even move those kids to areas of very lucrative careers that even make more than PhDs do. But you need to teach kids according to their level so that they can achieve at their level, and you don't want kids to fail. And so I've written before, this may be kind of a pithy saying, but I believe in it. Don't worry so much about the gaps between groups, but worry instead about the gaps within individuals. Don't worry about the gaps between groups, but worry about the gaps between individuals, within individuals. What is a gap within an individual? No matter where you are on the IQ continuum, all of us have what we can do with minimal effort versus what we can do when we're given extra help and we have higher motivation and better teaching for whatever it is our level is. So all of us don't achieve at the level that we're capable of achieving. And the goal of education should be teachers and school psychologists and counselors helping each individual kid, no matter what their intelligence level, of achieving more than they're currently achieving, because most of us, nearly all of us, don't achieve at levels that we're capable of achieving. So that would be my argument for what to take away from this. There's still a role for many professionals to motivate kids and give them the opportunities to achieve more than they're achieving now, no matter where you are on the IQ continuum.
Thank you, Dr. Frisbie. We are just about out of time, and we have still some really good questions that we would love to get your response to. And what we had discussed in advance is that we would take those questions offline and then post those responses later in the same area where the handout and the recording are posted. And I'll allow Sherry to come on and confirm that, but we're right at 3 o'clock now. And these questions are very good questions and require more than a minute to discuss, I'm sure.
Okay. And you have my email?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Great. Thank you so much for allowing me an opportunity to speak.
Thank you for coming. And we just have really enjoyed this presentation and really appreciate all the work and the history and the context that you were able to provide for this area. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'll hand it back over to Sherry.
Thank you, Dr. Frisbie, for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you, Dr. Drozdick, Dr. Rayford, and Dr. Puig for your Q&A help. Thank you all for your participation in our webinar today. Please leave your browser open as an action item list should pop up. Look for your certificate in your email within the next couple of weeks. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and this does conclude our webinar.
Thank you.